Hello, in this video, I want to somewhat quickly synthesize what I see as three basic approaches to evolution and the fall. Now, in my opinion, these are not, we can't say, well, Romans 5 is dealing with theological things and evolution is dealing with scientific things. In my opinion, we can't just say, well, they're two different things because there are implications. If God created the world purely in an evolutionary way, and there was no point at which there was a change in the way that God dealt spiritually with humanity, then God created it this way. That means God created suffering. It means that God created evil, or at least the situation with regard to evil. Actually, it doesn't necessarily mean that God created evil, as we'll see, but certainly God would have had to create a world of suffering as part of his plan for this creation. Now, there are philosophical implications for that, because it suggests that we would have to rethink whether or not accidentally chopping off your arm is a bad thing or not. We probably couldn't say that predation of lions and deers is a bad thing, and maybe it's not. I'm not here to say that that's a bad thing, but if there was no point in human history where there was a change in the nature of suffering and of human propensity to evil, there are implications for theology. And so I don't think we can escape this question of evolution and the fall simply by saying it's two different things, because there are implications of the one for the other that, as far as I can tell, are inescapable. And so we have to find some way to fit these two together, or not fit these two together, as the case may be. So I want to summarize the three basic approaches to evolution and the fall. The first is what I've called the Augustinian view, named after St. Augustine, who lived around the year AD 400. And of course, there are 4 centuries of Christians before Augustine. We're going to meet one of them in our third view. And so this is not the only Christian view, although sometimes, since we've grown up with it, I mean, I'm only a little over 50. And so, for me to say, well, I've not heard that view, it doesn't matter. I'm a spring chicken in the history of the world, right? Even if the earth is only 6,000 years old, I'm a newcomer. I'm a young guy. And so the Augustinian view may be the one that many of us, the only one we've heard of. And we may think, well, that's obviously the view, but that's probably because we're spring chickens. We've not been around for a while. There are other views that Christians have held, and they've been godly Christians, just as godly as Augustine. But the first view, the one that probably most of those who would watch a video like this are familiar with, is the Augustinian view. And for Augustine, he would say that Adam and Eve were the first humans to exist. But of course, there was no reason to think anything differently. That's the assumption. Talked last week about the difference between what the point of a biblical text is and what the assumption of a biblical text is. The assumptions of biblical texts may involve cultural factors, like a flat earth or a heaven that's straight up, those sorts of things. They can be the assumptions of a biblical text, in the same way that I have assumptions about the world too, that are very cultural, without being the point or the inspired point of a biblical text. So certainly Adam and Eve are the first humans to exist. And I would say that Paul assumes this too. Of course, Paul's not going to assume something different. And God's not giving a science lesson, in Romans 5. And so there would be no reason for God to Paul, I want you to let him in on evolution, in Romans 5. That would be pointless. That would be counterproductive. And so, in my opinion, Romans 5 says nothing pro or con toward there being any humans before Adam and Eve. The assumption of Romans 5 is that Adam and Eve are the first humans. Okay, so check there. Now, in Augustine's understanding, Adam and Eve were created immortal. They were created ontologically to live forever. They were created physically to live forever. They were created as immortal beings. but because of their sin, they were kicked out of the garden and were not able to eat from the tree of life. Now, I'm not quite sure how the tree of life plays in Augustine's view, because in Augustine's view, they are by default immortal. So it would seem that in Augustine's view, God has to do something to them to make them not be immortal. The tree seems somewhat irrelevant in Augustine's construction because they are immortal, and so God's going to have to do something to make them not immortal. And we've already talked in class about how this is not the way Genesis actually looks at it. In Genesis, they are created as dust. That is, they seem to be created as mortal in the Genesis story in Genesis 2. And it's only because they can't eat from the tree of life that they do not then go from being mortal to being immortal. And as we talked about in the video where I went through Jewish literature, I'm not given that all Jewish literature takes the stance of Genesis. All Jewish literature takes the stance, as far as I can tell, that Adam and Eve were created mortal and only did not become immortal because of not eating from the tree. And that when we think of Jewish literature saying that death entered the world through Adam, what it means is death remained the default because of Adam. They were created mortal, but because of Adam and his sin and them not eating from the tree, we've remained, death has remained. And therefore death, and not only physical death, of course, but spiritual death as well. I personally, as I try to listen to Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, it's hard for me, especially 1 Corinthians 15, not to hear physical death involved as well. So I do think that Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 in context are talking about physical death as well as spiritual death. But when they talk about death entering the world, what they mean is that humanity was not supposed to die. Death became the norm because of Adam and Eve's sin. Okay, we could have a little bit of debate about this last part, but I think inductively speaking, the first part is pretty clear if we let Genesis speak for itself. So the third point is then that the whole world, because of Adam and Eve's sin, the whole world became fallen. We now, Augustine would say, have a sinful nature. We have something inside of us that makes us sin. All humans have this sinful nature. We were, Romans 5:12, according to Augustine, we were in Adam when Adam sinned. And in a sense, we have Adam's sin inside of us. We have original sin that has continued with us. And therefore, because we have sin inside of us, and of course, Augustine would look at, I see another law in my members, Paul says, a law that wages against the law of my mind, Romans 7. So Augustine talks about us having a sinful nature. And this is very much Protestant categories from Luther, even Wesley, of course. This is the way that Protestants have tended in a very Augustinian way to talk about human sinfulness. Now, actually, I would say this is not exactly what Paul says. That Paul does not actually talk about his mind as being fallen. He says, with my mind I serve the law of God, but with my flesh, with my skin, I serve the law of sin. Paul talks about sin as a power. He never uses the word nature. Now, if you grew up on the old NIV translated the word flesh as sinful nature, following Augustine. But the word is skin, that it's my skin. That Paul has this duality in his imagery between my mind, which wants to do good. And so the part of me that is actually the part that I associate as most being me, Paul doesn't say is fallen. But there is this power over my skin in which my mind dwells. And my skin, without the Holy Spirit, there's no chance. Now, Paul believes that there is now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, because the law of the Spirit has set you free from the law of sin and death. Now, who will free me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So Paul believes in victory over the flesh. We can get out of our flesh, as it were. We can get out of that power of sin. He says in Romans 8, is it? Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. We can get out of our flesh, according to Paul. And so I would argue, and I have a PhD in New Testament, and this is not, I don't think, a particularly a unique view, by the way. This would be a fairly mainstream understanding of Paul, I think, that this last bullet here about the whole world being under a sinful nature is a Augustinian interpretation of Paul, and probably not the most original understanding of Paul. So Augustinian view, I'm not. I can translate the Augustinian view into better exegesis, better interpretation. The Augustinian view without the Augustine would be that Adam and Eve were the first humans to exist, that God intended them to be immortal by eating from the tree, but because of their sin, they didn't eat from the tree, and therefore humans are not immortal. And then lastly, that we are all under the power of sin, because as a result of Adam's sin. So I can translate Augustine into categories that are better exegetical categories, and maintain an Augustinian view today. So that's view number one. View number two is what I'm calling the synthesis view. This is a view that tries to blur together a historical Adam with the theory of evolution. So it's obviously going to mix and match. It's going to involve a little of this, a little of that. It's not a pure view. So it is a bit speculative, but it is the kind of thing that I think we have to do if we want to fit these two different things together. So this would be the view that evolution happened, and then there was a historical Adam and Eve. This would be the view that, for example, John Walton at Wheaton would have, and some others. So in this view, there was an Adam and Eve. That Adam and Eve did bring sin upon the world and upon humanity, but that they appeared after a long process of evolution. So in this approach, God would have created a world where evolution was the manner of creation. That God intended evolution. This is the way God. So I think we would have to say on this score that animal death is not bad. That animal predation of a basic sort is not bad. We would probably have to rethink death as bad in and of itself. I think of there are other cultures where dying is not seen as a great evil. It's natural. It comes and it's part of the cycle of life. I think of maybe Native American culture perhaps as having that kind of a view. But in this synthesis view, God would have created a world, and of course the objection there is from like 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, death, where is your sting? Death is swallowed up in victory. I think you would have to say, well, Paul is talking about human death there, not and human death in the face of what could have been, more than death in and of itself, I think is the way you would have to process that. So you could have someone like Francis Collins, who basically thinks that God has let natural selection go wherever it wanted to go, and that God didn't necessarily zap. The other alternative is that every once in a while God zapped the process and say, well, I want that amphibian to come on land. Well, I want that, and so forth. And so there's a couple different ways that you could view how God let the evolutionary process happen. So Collins would be a kind of God basically sitting back and saying, okay, I've got about 5,000 worlds right now where life is evolving, and let's see what they come up with. That kind of a view seems to be Collins's view. Or the other one would be more God saying, I want to do something a little special on that planet, that third rock from the sun. I'm gonna zap it a little bit, make sure it happens. Well, I don't want these dinosaurs. I don't really want them to be the ones. So I'm gonna send a little meteor, a little asteroid, gonna kind of wipe off the face of the earth. Then I'm gonna use this little mole beneath the surface, and I'm gonna make humans out of it eventually. So there's two different ways that you could take the way that God interacted with an evolutionary creation process. Collins kind of let it go, and then the zapping one. So then at some point in this process, we get to the time of Adam and Eve, and that's either either as a representative. So Walton would see them as representatives of Homo sapiens, as priest kings. Swamidas would see them as I'm going to make a little Adam and Eve on the side. It's going to be great. You like the sauce? And so Adam and Eve, either as representatives or a bottleneck, where Dr. Poitras presented some evidence that that you can make the math work for there to be a bottleneck in which all previous Homo sapiens come down to Adam and Eve. But in whatever way that happened, when Adam and Eve sinned, there was a change, that Adam and Eve were intended to be immortal by eating from the tree of life, but they don't eat from the tree of life, and death enters the world, which unleashes a spiritual power of sin over all humans. Now, this last bullet fits with, it gets to the same place as the Augustinian view. And that's what I want to highlight here. So basically, this synthesis view does evolution up to Adam and Eve, and then it basically comes up with the same thing. So in my opinion, this approach synthesizes what Romans 5 is about, what 1 Corinthians 15 is about, what Genesis 2 and 3 is about. It synthesizes that with the prevailing scientific understanding. And it does so in a way that I think can fit with inerrancy, because if inerrancy means the Bible's inerrant in all that it affirms, what is Romans 5 affirming? What is 1 Corinthians 15 affirming? What is Genesis 2 and 3 affirming? This difference between what it's cultural assumptions and cultural categories and what the point is, what it's affirming. And so this, again, we've seen lots of different views in our pilgrimage together. But this is a way, I'm not saying it's the way, but this would be a way to synthesize the biblical text with evolution as we understand it. So instead of a tree of life, now they die. So again, these last two bullets accomplish the same thing that Augustine's view accomplished. And then the first four bullets accomplish what most scientists would say in terms of evolution. Okay, so now we get to the final view. This is the Irenaean view, and I'm naming this after Irenaeus, who lived about 180 AD. So he's before Augustine. So this is a view before Augustine. Augustine is about 200 years later after Irenaeus. And so if Francis Collins is correct, Collins views Adam and Eve as mythical. Now, I really hesitate to use the word myth, because immediately when people who haven't studied these things hear myth, they think, oh, it's fake, it's a lie. That's not what the experts mean when they talk about myth. A myth, in the technical sense, is a story expressing a mystery. So it's when you tell a story that is meant to bring out a truth. And the point of the story is not that the story actually happened in history. The point of the story is to bring out the truth. In the same way that parables aren't mythical. That's, but a parable is not something that actually happened. It's a story. It's fictional, not fictional, not in the sense of being false, but fictional in the sense of genre, that this is not a historical story. This is a story. Again, I don't want to spend much time there, but if Collins were correct, then Adam and Eve would be a story expressing the human condition rather than something that actually happened in history. Now, Irenaeus had not, Augustine was not around. The Augustine synthesis had not yet happened. Augustine suggested around the year 180 that suffering and evil in the world create a context where we can grow morally. And so Irenaeus seems to assume that God created a world where there would be suffering. God created a world where we would get paper cuts. God created a world where there could be pandemics. Pandemics aren't evil unless there's a human mind. Evil is only when the agency of a mind is involved. So it's not evil when a rock falls on me. That's just unfortunate. You know what I'm saying? Evil is when I do something, or when Satan does something. A being that thinks must be involved for it to truly be evil. Suffering is when a volcano blows up on you while you're hiking. That's suffering. And so in the Irenaean understanding, God created a world where there was suffering. God created a world where there were paper cuts. God created Adam from dust, where Adam could die, where death was his default. And so Irenaeus basically would say that that kind of that suffering creates a kind of a moral jungle gym. I'm going to the moral gym today. A rock's going to fall on my foot. Let's see how I do. That kind of a thing. And so Irenaeus suggested that God created a suffering world so that we could face moral choices. How am I going to react to this? There's a pandemic. Am I going to go out without a mask and potentially infect a bunch of people, or am I going to be responsible and protect others and look out for other people, and not just myself? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What am I going to do in a time of suffering? Am I going to rise to the challenge and become, if you lie in a bed for a month, your muscles are going to atrophy. No pain, no gain. This is the Irenaean theodicy, as it's called, explanation for why there's suffering in the world. And of course, evil is, as we'll see on the next slide, a result of God giving us the choice. That if God gives moral beings like humans the choice whether to do good or to do evil, some people are going to do evil. And so Irenaeus suggested that the reason why God has allowed this to happen, and he doesn't, as far as I know, does not factor Adam and Eve into the equation. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't think Irenaeus factors Adam and Eve into that equation. For Irenaeus, suffering is a context in which we can make moral choices and become moral beings. So in the Irenaean understanding, this could mean that suffering was built into the creation to create an environment where we can either choose good or evil, or grow and grow in consequence for our decision. By the way, this seems to be the primary base camp of C.S. Lewis. Now, in C.S. Lewis's science fiction trilogy, like Perelandra, he does have this sense of an Adam and Eve, but it is fictional. Of course, it's science fiction, and C.S. Lewis seems, in general, to sit lightly to the question of whether there's an Adam, and he sits lightly to evolution too. I mean, he says, I can handle this in my theology, whether evolution is true or not. I can handle this in my theology, whether Adam and Eve are historical or not. So Lewis is not opposed to Adam and Eve, but he doesn't need Adam and Eve, as it were, in his theology. But here is a quote from C.S. Lewis's, I think it's from his Problem of Pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. You see, we are like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves the forms of men. The blows of his chisel, which hurt so much, are what make us perfect. This is an expression of the Irenaean theodicy, the Irenaean explanation for evil. It sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? Kind of cold. God sounds kind of cold. I'm going to carve you a little today. It's going to hurt. You're going to lose a toe, but you're going to be better for it. You're going to thank me for this. But anyway, C.S. Lewis seems to, by and large, express this kind of understanding of why there's suffering in the world. And then C.S. Lewis would basically have what we call the free will explanation for evil. That God, and Augustine has this as well. Although for Augustine, it goes back to Adam, that God gave Adam free will, and then everything else is a consequence of his choice. Lewis seems to think more in the way a lot of us do popularly, that God gives each one of us free will to choose God or not to choose God. Now, technically, Christian theology has believed in total depravity. That is, that without God's power, we can make no good moral choices. We might, the Wesleyan tradition sometimes talks about what's called prevenient grace, that powers us up, that by the grace of God, we can be powered up to make good choices. But in the end, the idea here is that we have we can either choose good or choose evil, and because we have that freedom, some humans are going to choose evil, and therefore there's going to be evil in the world. But a world in which we can choose is a better world than a world in which we can't choose. That's the sense here. Now, there might be an implication from Lewis's view here, from the Irenaeus view, that humans are not inherently deprived. If we follow this, again, this is this idea that This isn't just a matter of interpreting Romans or interpreting evolution. There are implications. If we take this kind of a view, it might suggest that we are all in the same state as Adam. I think that's probably what it may suggest. Although you could argue for a kind of cumulative power of sin that results from more humans making more evil choices. I mean, who knows what you could come up with if you ran with this? But this view seems to suggest that we are all little Adams and Eves, and that we all face the same choices that Adam and Eve did under the same basic circumstances, where each of us could choose the good or could choose the evil, and so there doesn't seem in this view to be any point in history where something changed to where the world became, say, more sinful or more suffering, and that could be for some a problem with regard to the existence of evil, because it would suggest that God more or less made the world as it is. God made a world where Hitlers could be. God made a world where Mussolini, Stalin, God made a world where that kind of evil. God made a world for Holocausts, and so for some that's just too much. But okay, this is basically the three perspectives on evolution and the fall as we have fleshed them out and flushed them out in our conversations in Science and Scripture.